Welcome to our podcast. This is another recorded episode of Stay Classy San Diego, with video production and studio provided by MaxLux Media at maxluxmedia.com, with your host being myself, Steve Wire, a freelance reporter. This podcast is dedicated to fostering quality dialogue surrounding all things local policy in the North County, San Diego area. Join us weekly as we interview political leaders, analysts, professionals, and community members on issues ranging from homelessness to housing to elections. So today we bring into the studio Scott Anders. Scott is an experienced professional in the field of energy and climate policy with a focus on advancing a low-carbon economy. He's currently the director of the East Energy Policy Initiative Center at USD School of Law, where he works on regulatory and policy issues related to renewable energy and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Prior to his current position, he worked as a senior manager at the Center for Sustainable Energy and as a policy researcher for a think tank in Washington, D.C. He's also served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Mali. Mr. Anders holds a BA in International Politics from Muhlenberg College and an MA in Public Policy from the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. So thank you so much, Scott, for coming onto the show today. We're really excited to have you. And specifically, we wanted to cover some of the state and local issues related to climate change and related to renewable energy. This is the first episode in a several-part series that we're actually going to be doing on the subject here on this podcast. So we're going to be bringing in Scott and some other experts as well in some episodes to come. But the first thing I wanted to talk about is sort of just for people who aren't familiar with the Energy Policy Initiative Center is, can you sort of explain what it is that the center does, like what kind of research you guys are involved in and how you relate to state and local agencies?
Sure. Yeah, I can give you a quick summary of our center and our founding and what we do. So we were founded back in about 15 years ago. We were founded to do two things. One is to train law students in the area of energy law and policy. And the second one is to do research and analysis to kind of inform decision makers around some of these important issues. And so our work kind of centers around those two separate things. For the moment, I'll put aside the teaching of law students, which involves classes and practicum experiences. And I'll focus a little bit more on the research and analysis that we do to inform decision makers. And so we work with primarily local agencies, state governments and agencies in our region. We also do a bit of work with some state agencies as well on some of these issues. And so as an example of what we do here locally, we support climate action plan development around the region. So we've supported most of the climate action plans that are in place here today. We've done other kinds of research and analysis around carbon offset credits, water energy nexus, any number of topics related to energy and climate policy. But so yeah, today we're really going to be talking mostly about the kind of the research and analysis side of our house.
Absolutely. I want to start at the broad level, sort of the broadest picture possible for us, which is the state level, I think, is a good place to start. So in 2022, towards the end of the year, the California Air Resources Board actually passed a scoping plan, which is essentially a state action plan outlining carbon neutrality goals. Specifically, carbon neutrality by 2045 is the main goal. And it has a bunch of specific components to it. I want to get into this plan a little bit and talk about how realistic, how achievable these goals are, sort of what policies will have to be implemented. Just some specific details about the plan. State regulators want California to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 48% below 1990 levels by 2030 and achieve full carbon neutrality by 2045. And it would call for a 94% reduction in petroleum use between 2022 and 2045, and an 86% reduction in total fossil fuel use. And it would overall cut greenhouse gas emissions by 85% by 2045 relative to 1990 levels. So obviously some really ambitious goals here, a lot of different numbers floating around, but sort of for our purposes, like what should we expect to see in the years and decades to come, sort of as far as concrete policy changes in California in kind of the furtherance towards these goals?
Yeah, and maybe in my response, I'll zoom out and then zoom in,
Yeah.
if that's okay. And so yeah, basically what the scoping plan is telling us is that we have to reduce emissions significantly. We also have to preserve our existing carbon stocks, so that would be our forests and other natural stores of carbon. And then we have to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So we have to reduce, preserve, remove. And if you kind of take those kind of piece by piece, we can start to get into a little bit more detail about what the state of California is doing and what others are doing. And so of this reduce, preserve, remove framework, reducing is probably the most important. That's the heavy lift. So you said it. You said those big numbers of reductions in emissions due largely to the reduction or replacement of fossil fuels with some other cleaner fuel type. So the heavy lift is reducing emissions, or another way to put it is avoiding emissions, right? So we're going to be avoiding future emissions. And the way that the state of California has kind of laid out its plan to do that in general is first to decarbonize the electricity supply through production of renewable electricity. And then the second step, or second and third step, however you look at it, is to electrify basically everything else that can be electrified. So that's transportation through electric vehicles, and the building stock through the electrification of appliances, and other things too, to the extent that they're possible. But really, that's sort of the, excuse me, that's the overall framework. Decarbonize electricity and electrify buildings and transportation. And there are other very important aspects of reducing emissions, in particular reducing methane emissions, which have a higher global warming potential, have a bigger impact on the atmosphere, and they also have a shorter lifetime. So working on these so-called short-lived climate pollutants is very important. I don't want to minimize it, but kind of the main thrust of that reduction piece is clean energy and electrification.
Sure.
So that's kind of, and you'll see that throughout the scoping plan, and you'll see that throughout the state of California's policies. We have a goal for 100% carbon-free electricity by 2045 in the state of California, and we are moving along that timeline. We're sort of, partway there. We're not quite halfway, but we're getting there. But that process has to accelerate in the next few years, and it will require a significant, some may say historic, amount of new renewable electricity and energy storage.
Sure.
So that's happening. That's what's happening there. On the preserve carbon stocks, the state of California is pursuing this so-called 30 by 30 initiative. And this was a governor's executive order originally to preserve and protect 30% of California's natural and working lands and oceanways by the year 2030. And so it's not just to preserve carbon stocks, but that's clearly a piece of this. So preserving the existing carbon stocks so that if we have an acre of forest, we want that acre of forest to stay an acre of forest as long as possible. If it burns, it turns into carbon, and it exacerbates the problem we're trying to solve. And then the third piece, and this is really interesting because it's relatively new, the remove part of the equation. So basically, if you look at the scoping plan, it talks about all the ways that we can reduce emissions to a certain level, but it doesn't say we can reduce emissions to zero.
Sure.
Right? It's very difficult. Somebody once said zero is a very small number. It's very difficult to get to zero. So the state of California seeks to reduce emissions to the extent possible with those numeric targets that you talked about. And then the challenge is going to be to figure out how to compensate for or neutralize, if you will, those remaining emissions that we inevitably will have in 2045 or 2040 or 2050, et cetera, going forward for many decades. And so how do we address that? And the way you do that is that you remove carbon from the atmosphere and you store it in ways that are stable for millennia, if possible. And this, as I said, is a relatively new piece. The California Air Resources Board, if you look at their history of working with greenhouse gases since the mid-2000s, they've only very recently started to talk about removals, and their latest scoping plan talks about that as well. And we're really at the beginning of the technological curve of some of these technologies. But we don't want the technologies and the conversation around removing carbon from the atmosphere to take away any time, any energy, any focus from the reductions. The reductions, I couldn't say it enough.
Mm-hmm.
reducing emissions is the heavy lift. That's where we should be focusing our time. But we can walk and chew gum, right? We can walk and talk. We can do things. We can have two thoughts at once. And so, at the same time that we're doing everything we can to reduce emissions, we also need to be thinking forward and planning out how do we neutralize and compensate for those remaining emissions through removal technologies and strategies, and then long-term storage.
Sure. So the plan has a lot of ambitious components to it, and specifically to meet the targets, state officials project that California over the next 20 years will need about, and I think you mentioned this, 30 times more electric vehicles, 6 times more household electrical appliances to replace gas, 4 times an increase of fourfold for wind and solar generation capacity. By 2045, this is supposed to cost the state about $27 billion. So I'm just trying to figure out, like, are these targets, like, how achievable are these targets, and like, how do we start to move in this direction as a state?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're challenging targets, right? I don't think anybody looks at those numbers you just rattled off and says, piece of cake. We know that the road ahead of us is going to be challenging. It's not going to be cheap. On the other hand, we also know that the climate impacts that have been forecasted are happening sooner. They're worse than we've anticipated, and they're actually more costly than we had anticipated. So, challenging road ahead, not cheap. Cost of inaction is also not cheap. So like I said, it's going to be a challenge. What are we doing? Well, like I said, the state of California for many decades has had a climate policy in place. The original kind of state climate action law enabling legislation was in 2006. The California Global Warming Solutions Act, AB 32, that was in 2006. And so we've been at this for some time, and we've increased the amount of renewable electricity that's being delivered to customers. There's more electric vehicles being added every year, et cetera, et cetera. So we're on the trajectory. That's kind of, so we know where we need to be going, and we're kind of on the pathway. The question is, your question is, can we get there? How soon can we get there? How hard will it be? I mean, I can't predict the future. I like to say that my crystal ball is as cloudy as anybody else's. But what I do know is that the policy framework that's in place is definitely what is needed to keep us on that pathway, including milestones and targets kind of along the way. So more investment. We have federal investment from the federal government now through the Inflation Reduction Act and other infrastructure legislation, which will provide significant funding for these kinds of projects as well.
Sure. I'm just going to give some pushback from some critics of the plan here. So
Sure.
One of the arguments that's being made is that the plan relies too much on a method of carbon capture and sequestration instead of relying on natural working lands to house some of that carbon. So this is according to Chirag Bhakta, who's the California State Director for the Food and Water Watch, in a statement said that this plan is failing the people of California by endorsing carbon capture, a faulty climate scheme promoted by the fossil fuel industry. Carbon capture is a completely unproven and unworkable technology that only serves to provide cover for oil and gas drillers to continue business as usual. Is there any validity to this criticism? What do you think about this?
Well, what I would say is, you're gonna keep hearing me say this. I want to zoom out. I want to add context. I want to kind of dig in a little bit on some of that. So, first thing I would say is that we need to make a distinction between carbon capture and storage on an existing power plant or an existing facility. So, in other words, capturing the emissions that are coming out of a power plant before they hit the atmosphere, and then doing something with that carbon. I would consider that a reduction in my reduce, preserve, remove framework, because that is preventing emissions from getting into the atmosphere, right? That's a reduction. It's an avoided emission. If you didn't capture those emissions at the stack, they would go into the atmosphere. So, and there are some industries where this makes sense. There are also, it seems, some instances where, we will be relying on natural gas power plants for the foreseeable future for reliability. And so there's a question of whether it makes sense to do that there. Again, I'm talking about capturing the emissions at the source that otherwise would be emitted. So that's carbon capture and storage. I'll use those terms. I mean, we have a term. There's some terminological confusion here. I would contrast that with carbon dioxide removal. So carbon removal, that's removing carbon that's already in the atmosphere. So those two things are completely distinctive. I'm not sure which one the commenter is referring to, but it's clear that carbon dioxide removal technology is in the nascent stage. There are very few examples of the engineered technologies that are actually deployed and actually removing carbon. It's still early days in that process. It reminds me a little bit of the solar industry back in the 90s and the early 2000s, where it was a nascent industry, a few things here and there. When we talked about solar back then, people kind of rolled their eyes and laughed and said, can you actually put solar on every house? Does it actually scale up? And that was when we had 10 or 20 rooftop systems, and now we have hundreds of thousands of rooftop systems in the San Diego region. So I'm also not suggesting that carbon dioxide removal technologies will follow that same path. I'm just saying that it's early days for those technologies. And as I said earlier, we shouldn't be putting all of our eggs in that basket. We shouldn't be putting our eggs in any basket, all of our eggs in one basket. But we should be thinking about how do we remove enough carbon in the future to get to net zero.
Sure.
Another piece of this is the difference between, and again, I'll try to parse this out a little bit, but the sort of the contrast between natural climate solutions and engineered climate solutions in terms of removing carbon. And so it's true that if you plant forests, they absorb carbon in the woody part of the plant, in the roots, and some gets fixed into the soil. And so there is definitely a process for doing that. I think there's a question about whether or not natural working lands or natural climate solutions alone can scale up to the point where we would be removing the amount of emissions we need to remove to get to net zero. I would also say that one of the challenges is the permanency of the storage. For once you've removed the carbon, what do you do with it? A tree stores it again in its branches, in its bark, and in its roots. The question is that tree going to be here in 10, 50, 100, 500 years and continue to store that carbon? And this is a significant challenge for us going forward, to figure out ways to cost effectively and in a way that doesn't increase emissions, remove a ton of carbon from the atmosphere, and then store it in a way that remains stored, hopefully in perpetuity, but certainly on the order of thousands of years.
Sure. So I want to stay zoomed out at the state level for a minute. So in talking about the state's climate action goals, I think it's also important to mention how the state is progressing towards renewable energy goals, particularly in the lights of the blackouts and power failures that we've experienced as a state in the last few years. So in 2020, California experienced a whole series of blackouts due to a combination of factors that included extreme heat, wildfires, and an over-reliance upon certain renewable energy sources. Now, these blackouts affected millions of residents and businesses and led to calls for actions to prevent similar events in the future. Now, what I want to talk to you about is, given the history of power outages and blackouts, what policies are key for managing the grid and preventing outages during peak energy demands going forward, particularly in light of the increase in demand for electricity from electronic vehicles? Electricity use is expected to soar by as much as 68% by 2045, so the demand is only growing. How do we manage the grid and prevent these kinds of disasters from occurring again?
Yeah, this is a real problem, a real challenge. I think you laid it out clearly. It's we're going to be relying. So I mentioned earlier that the framework for California to reduce emissions is decarbonize the electric grid, which means more renewable resources, and then electrify everything else. And so what that means is we have more so-called intermittent resources. In other words, the sun shines when the sun shines, and the sun doesn't shine at night. And wind though is somewhat predictable, is variable. So these are variable sources, as opposed to a more steady source like a natural gas plant or a nuclear plant or a coal plant, which doesn't run 24/7, but runs very predictably and can ramp up and down depending on demand. So this is the inherent challenge. And I will also say, and you teed this up similarly as well, this is happening at the same time that the grid is experiencing uh, external challenges, if you will, around heat waves and wildfires. And so at the same time, we're trying to get more out of the grid and really putting a lot of strain. We're asking a lot of the electric grid, right? We're asking it to do the heavy lift to get us to net zero. But at the same time, we're doing that in a context of a changing climate where we are seeing unprecedented heat waves and we are seeing more wildfires, which can affect the electric system. And so it is definitely a challenge. To talk about the heat wave of last year, again, really it was pretty unprecedented. And it was longer, it was hotter, and it exhibited what some climate scientists have predicted. And I would strongly encourage you to get some climate scientists on your podcast here for the series. But one of the things that I've heard from climate scientists over time is that the heat waves there will be an increase in humidity over time, but also that the nighttime temperatures will be high. And we experienced that last September when we had those unprecedented outages or near outages. And I recall, and it's one of those days, I'm a kind of an energy nerd, so I'll kind of remember a lot of these things. But one of the things I'll never forget is sitting in my house, quite warm, no air conditioning, trying not to put a strain on the grid, when the California emergency alert came out to everybody's cell phone. And I turned to my wife and I said, this is getting serious if they're doing this. So it was, clearly a huge issue. Okay, so we have, there's sort of a couple sides of the equation. One is the supply side and one is the demand side to keep electric reliability high. And that's what we're talking about, right? We want to have a reliable system that doesn't ever go out. Well, we're never going to have a system that never goes out. I would love to have that, and I think we should strive for zero outages. But life happens, and so the question is, how do we minimize outages and increase reliability to the extent possible? And on the supply side of the grid, there are policies in place in California to require power providers to have certain reserves on hand under normal circumstances, right? I mean, when you have a heat dome over the Western United States for 7 days, it's tough to plan for, but that's an important piece. We should be planning for a different future, or trying to think about that future in a different way. So having more reserves, right? More power at the ready to be supplied.
Sure.
There's also, as we add more renewables, we need more storage, because most of the time the dominant renewable source in California is solar, and the peak demand time is between 4 p.m. and 9 p.m. And between 4 p.m. and 9 p.m., there's not much solar happening.
Yeah.
So we need to pair energy production with energy storage, and this is happening. We're seeing more and more new plants coming on. They're renewables plus storage, solar plus storage, wind plus storage, and they can have operating characteristics that are similar to a fossil fuel based plant. And so we need to see more of that. And you mentioned in an earlier question about the number of the record number of new power generating capacity we're going to see, or we're going to need, and that's going to be coupled with an unprecedented amount of storage that we're going to need as well. So those are a couple other things that help. On the demand side, and it was that very same night when the emergency alert went out, that said, reduce your use, don't turn on your air conditioners or whatever. It worked to an extent because we avoided a blackout, and in that case, and that was in large part because of that signal. And you can see it in the curve where there's a little notch in the curve where the demand actually went down. Now,
you're referring to the duck curve?
Not the duck curve. We can get to that
we can talk
in a
about
second. This was the demand curve, demand supply curve that day. part of the duck curve, but this isn't the duck curve. But yeah, this call actually reduced demand and helped stave off an outage. Now there's a question of whether, if you did that every day, it's going to stop working, right? This was literally an unprecedented event that required, pulling out all the stops to get us to reduce demand. But there could be more sort of formalized, institutionalized ways of reducing demand. There are customers, more and more residential customers, commercial customers have energy storage on site that could be leveraged to charge up during the day, dispatch at night when we need the power more. So there are a number of things to do on both the supply and the demand side to help. One important piece, and I know that it's a controversial thing probably for your viewers and listeners, is the rates and how rates are structured and designed. And we really want to encourage less consumption in the evening and ways of shifting consumption, if possible, from the middle of the day to the evening. And for a homeowner, there's not a whole lot you can shift around. If you have energy storage, a battery or something, there are potentially ways of doing that. But this is the biggest challenge for keeping the grid reliable over the next, now, right? But then also, while we're doing all of those things that you said would be required to meet California's targets. So,
Sure.
Yes, I would say this is one of the biggest challenges for decarbonizing the state, is making sure that we can decarbonize the grid, have enough capacity to electrify everything else, and keep reliability as high as possible.
Sure, absolutely. Hey there, San Diego. If you're on the hunt for a way to enhance your health, I have a great recommendation for you. Dorado Nutrition is a company that's all about helping people live their best lives through top-notch American-made supplements. Their expert team has crafted products to support a variety of health needs, from weight management to muscle building and more. And with ingredients like Vidosia agrestis and Tonkat Ali, praised by a well-known neurobiologist seen on the Joe Rogan podcast, these supplements could be just what you need to reach your health goals. And for a limited time, you can get 25% off your purchase by using promo code SD2023 at checkout. So if you're looking for a way to improve your health, Dorado Nutrition might just be the solution you need. Now, in the interest of time, I want to talk about, when you talk about the package of renewable energy sources, like we talk about wind and solar, and specifically sort of how there was an over-reliance upon these renewable energy sources that contributed to the blackouts in 2020. Now, part of the conversation, I feel like, has to be what should be done about nuclear energy. Now, with nuclear, we have obviously, we did have two nuclear power plants in California. We had Diablo and San Onofre. San Onofre is in the process of decommissioning. Diablo, it's sort of up in the air. There's been a push to extend Diablo beyond 2030. At the same time, it still has a lot of opponents. Now, a couple notes about Diablo. In 2020, experts at the California Independent System Operator warned that when the plant closes, the state will reach a critical inflection point, which will create significant challenges to ensure the reliability of the grid without resorting to more fossil fuel usage. A 2021 report from researchers at MIT and Stanford states that keeping Diablo running until 2035 would reduce the state's carbon emissions from electricity generation by 11% every year. So when it comes to Diablo, which provides about 10% of our state's electricity, it's a clean source of energy. It's a source of energy that can help the state meet its carbon neutral goals. Why is nuclear not more of a part of the conversation about the package of renewables moving forward when it comes to the conversation about state goals? Why is nuclear sort of left out of the conversation?
Yeah, and so maybe we could start with some kind of definitions of things. So nuclear is not considered renewable. The state of California has a definition of what a renewable resource is, and it includes solar, wind, geothermal, small hydro, biomass, sort of sources like that. And then there are carbon-free sources. I like to think of these are all carbon-free, but under the state's kind of way that the state kind of categorizes things, there are other resources that don't generate emissions but are not renewable, and that would be nuclear and large hydro. So again, if we go back to my original framework, reduce, preserve, remove, we need to reduce emissions to the extent possible, and we should be bringing to bear all the tools we can in order to do that. Again, we have a lot of things to balance here, but if we want to reduce to the extent possible, we need to be using all the tools we can. So having said that, um, by the way, the very recently, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission denied PG&E's petition to review and keep open their request to extend that
Yeah.
license. I think they're gonna reapply, and that will continue. I think Diablo Canyon is a specific and discrete case we're talking about. I think you may be asking, as far as I'm concerned, carbon-free electric generation is important, and if Diablo Canyon can provide that going forward, then I think that's probably a good thing, given the timing and the necessity of reducing emissions. But having said that, the state of California does have in place a law that says that there will be no new nuclear power sited in California until there is basically a federal solution to the storage of the waste. And that hasn't happened yet. And so given that, unless there's a change in the state law, there really is no role at this point for additional nuclear power in the state of California.
Yeah, but in your opinion, like, is that something that we should sort of be like re-looking at, or is that like sort of just the way it is, like, and it's time to like push towards other renewable energy sources, or is it sort of time to re-examine our sort of philosophical, conceptual approach at the state level, maybe even at the federal level, to nuclear?
Yeah, no, I think that as far as I'm concerned, like I kind of implied earlier, sort of everything's on the table. But I do think we have a lot to balance, right? We have time, we have cost, we have impact, other impacts, and no electricity generation, no generation source is free, no generation source has zero impact. Everything has an impact. I think it's just a question of degree. And so I think we have to ask the question of, whether or not it makes sense to build the kinds of plants we built in the past in terms of safety issues, and then going forward, does it? We still have the waste issue to deal with, which is the basis of the California moratorium in the first place, and then newer technologies that we're hearing about, so-called modular reactors, smaller systems. There are. It's not clear to me that they're ready to go, steel in the ground tomorrow. And so I think we have to ask ourselves the question, if we're taking those California milestones as our roadmap, what do we need to do to meet those? Can we do it with existing technology? Do we need other technology? I think those are important questions. I don't have an answer, but
Yeah.
I do think that the challenge before us to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions is such that it requires us to kind of consider all options and to rethink all assumptions.
Yeah. Well, and I think that like rethinking those assumptions, like there's a lot of assumptions people make about nuclear power. Like I think when it comes to nuclear power, there's some misconceptions or myths, correct me if I'm wrong, such as, nuclear, there's sort of this innate association people have between nuclear power and nuclear weapons. People think about the 3 Mile Island disaster, people think about Fukushima, people think about Chernobyl. And I'm not sure that these comparisons are always accurate given the level of advanced technology that we have now at nuclear reactors that make meltdowns less likely, that make radiation leaks less likely. And I mean, nuclear power, just to list off a few interesting facts, it avoids more than 470 million metric tons of carbon each year, which is the equivalent of taking about 100 million cars off the road. And you also have the fact that nuclear power has the capability to operate up for 2 years before refueling and produce maximum power more than 93% of the time during the year, which makes it 3 times as reliable as wind and solar. So you have a very reliable source of energy, you have a very clean source of energy, you have a source of energy that is relatively safe, that we don't see these kinds of radiation leaks anymore. So can you sort of talk about some of the fact versus reality, or the myth versus reality conceptions that people have about nuclear power and how that should sort of inform our policy approach?
Yeah, I think that there may be some misconceptions. I heard, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but that in a given year, more people die of health impacts of coal than have died from nuclear power plants, because while we have had these large kind of high profile issues, which, not to minimize them in any way, are relatively few over the history of time. So you may be, there may be some misconceptions. I think one of the biggest challenges, fact or fiction, some of these things have kind of seeped into our consciousness, and I think that there is a public acceptance challenge with nuclear, and I just think that's a fact. And whether or not the myths are true or not, there is this kind of uphill battle with the public perception.
Yeah.
And I would say another thing to think about, and this is true with anything, right? We haven't even talked about this, but you talked about all that. We're going to need a lot of renewable energy production. We're going to need a lot of energy storage. All those things have to go somewhere. And as wonderful and as clean as some people think renewable electricity production is, it's got to go somewhere. And the people whose backyard those wind turbines are in or solar panels are in are not always happy. And so I think that I raised that because if there were a plan to site a nuclear power plant today, I think the question would be, where would you put it? And how hard would it be to site? And what would the political acceptance level be of a nuclear plant, say in the state of California, say in the region of San Diego, right?
Sure.
And it's difficult to cite just about anything. And so I think that is a real challenge for nuclear, regardless of whether it makes sort of economic sense or carbon sense or some other kind of analytical sense.
Sure.
I think there's definitely a public relations challenge and a siting challenge for technologies like that. And again, anything to get cited, whether it's a wind turbine, a solar power, a battery.
Much less a nuclear power plant.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Much less, right. So this is a real challenge.
Yeah. And then I know I've been mindlessly listing off a lot of stats, but this is something I found interesting in researching for our purposes today, is that a 2009 NASA report actually showed that nuclear power, because of the amount of carbon that comes out of the atmosphere each year, or that avoids production each year with those 470 million metric tons of carbon each year, actually nuclear power has prevented, according to NASA, about 1.8 million deaths from air pollution between 1971 and 2009. So I thought that was an interesting stat to throw out there when you talk about safety in terms of the possibility of meltdowns and people's concerns over radiation leaks, but the reality of the harm caused by fossil fuels to human health and to human safety, I think, is like an interesting kind of rejoinder to that side of thinking.
Yeah, but I would say that that's true of renewable electricity as well.
Yeah.
It may be more true with what you just talked about, because during that period, that was much dirtier power production. That's another thing to think about, right? Is that this is a dynamic analysis that we have. So the grid in California today is way cleaner than the grid was 20 years ago, and it's going to be way cleaner 20 years from now. So every time you add a new resource, the greenhouse gas impact gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So if you're talking about 1970, when the predominant source was coal, it was made a huge impact, for no question about it. But and then going forward, if you put in, whether you put in a wind turbine or you put in a nuclear power plant or you put in a solar array, you're going to be offsetting a much lower amount of emissions, which is a good thing, right?
Sure.
It's a good thing.
Yeah.
So but I would say that at this point, a zero emission, any zero emission power producing technology could make the same argument that you just made.
Sure. I want to talk a little bit about the research that your organization does as well. So one thing that you guys look at a lot is that EPIC looks at is water energy research, and particularly I want to talk about why it's important for the purposes of climate science for us to better understand how it is that water regulations and policies actually interact with our energy and climate policies, and sort of what the relation is there and sort of what the focus of that research looks like to you.
Yeah, so I guess there are a couple ways of looking at this water energy nexus, as we call it. So, one piece of this is that the changing climate is going to affect the supply of water in the state of California, which, by the way, has a huge impact on energy production. We have one of our significant carbon-free power sources is large hydro, coming from mostly from the Northwest. And that is a function of, how much water is behind the dam. And we've seen in some cases where reservoirs in the U.S., the levels have been getting so low that they were going below the level possible to generate hydropower. So the changing climate affects the hydrological cycle, which affects the possibility of doing large hydro, a good carbon-free, I shouldn't say good, but some people think it's good, a carbon-free resource, right? So that's one piece. But when you look at energy production itself, you have energy production in some cases, and it's changing, requires water. And so you mentioned nuclear. You know that both nuclear plants in California are located on the coast. They're located on the coast because they need water to cool. And historically, a lot of other power plants have been located along the coast. In other parts of the world, they're located on rivers or places where they can use water to cool their plant for thermal efficiencies. And so to the extent that a power production technology needs water, then that's an issue, because we're going to, we've been in a historic drought, notwithstanding this very rainy winter we've had this year. Hopefully we have more like this, but we still are in critical shape when it comes to water statewide. And so, to the extent that that's the case, and there's competing interests for water, using it to generate electricity may not be the best use of that water. Then there's the other side of the equation, which is in California, we use quite a bit of energy associated with water use. And so some of that is pumping it long distances, including over the Tehachapi Mountains to get from Northern to Southern California. But most of it is the energy associated with water consumption at the end use. So your water heater, your dishwasher, the efficiency of your clothes washing appliances. So there's the energy that we use to heat and move water. There's the water used in electricity production. And then I would say kind of a meta issue that I raised the first piece was the fact that the changing climate is kind of changing the hydrological cycle, which definitely has an energy connection to it.
Sure, absolutely. Another big focus for you guys, correct me if I'm wrong, is climate equity. With the Climate Equity Index is something that you guys actually put together, working with San Diego. I want you to talk a little bit for people so climate equity, just sort of the concept of it, why it's important for us to understand the impact of climate action policies on these underserved communities. And then sort of what was the Climate Equity Index, and how did it sort of further those sorts of goals?
Yeah. So I mentioned a bit ago about balancing. From a technological standpoint, or from an engineering standpoint, or an analytical standpoint, we could run the spreadsheets, we can do the math, and we can tell you this is what you need to do, right? But that's not how the world works, right? There are people in the world, and people, there are impacts of things, and there's other things to consider. And so I think that's kind of where this is one of those issues that we have to balance. And so, the question is, who bears the brunt of some of the impacts of climate change, or of the impacts of electricity production, for example, over time? And who's benefiting from the policies that we're putting in place to try to reduce emissions? And so, for example, we've put a lot of money recently over the years into rooftop solar and into electric vehicles. And more recently, so the question, I think the big question there is, who owns those systems and who's benefiting from those systems? And I think over time, the policymakers have said, we want to make sure that we recognize that the burdens of climate impacts are not equal, and we want to make sure that the benefits are distributed more equally. And so that's kind of if you will, in a nutshell, kind of the way to think about climate equity, or the social equity aspect of the climate policy work that we do and the state of California is doing. So specific to the city of San Diego, there are some statewide tools to look at social equity through kind of an environmental or energy or climate lens, but they're statewide. And so what they're doing is they're comparing regions of the state to one another. And so when you look at the statewide results, you get a lot of areas in the Central Valley of California which are highlighted as what are their so-called disadvantaged communities according to the state tool. And the question is, well, we live in San Diego, and maybe relative to the Central Valley, some of our communities aren't similarly affected or impacted, but we know that we have communities in our region that are. And so the idea was, hey, let's try to make a tool within the city of San Diego that compares across the neighbors and the neighborhoods and the communities in the city of San Diego to try to figure out which communities may be more impacted by some of these issues and may not have access to some of the benefits that other communities do. And so our team worked with the city of San Diego, and they had an equity stakeholder group. So there was some public engagement and stakeholder engagement to come up with an index which looks at a number of indicators, individual indicators of things like energy poverty, which is or energy burden, I should say, which is like the amount that somebody pays as a percentage of their overall income on energy, transportation burden. We looked at demographic issues like income and a whole host. I think it was 20 or 30 indicators, and then we bundled them together in a way to try to kind of come up with a composite score, if you will, for each neighborhood unit. And the way that this is being used is that the city of San Diego now is using this as a tool to allocate resources, to direct programming activities. It was used to inform their most recent climate action plan. And so it's become kind of I like to use a medical kind of analogy or a metaphor. So it's like the Climate Equity Index helps in a way to kind of diagnose the issue. Where are the problems? We can look at this to kind of see where the problems are. But then you can also use it to kind of to treat those problems, right? It's like, well, if you look at the Climate Equity Index or some of the underlying indicators, and they show that there are certain neighborhoods that are experiencing high levels of heat and expected to have even more heat and have very low tree cover, well, then maybe those are areas that are a good place to plant trees if you have a goal to plant more trees in your climate action plan, for example.
Sure.
And the city of San Diego now has a climate equity fund where they're directing some funding. And again, the Climate Equity Index is a tool to help them allocate that. So, and again, I would encourage you to have somebody on from the city of San Diego to talk more about what they're doing in particular for their climate planning work.
Sure. Before we go, I do want to talk briefly about sort of localizing this conversation with San Diego's climate action plan, which was recently adopted. So again, there's a net zero greenhouse gas emissions goal by 2035 for this plan. I again want you to sort of talk about how realistic or achievable this is, and like sort of what progress are we making, like what hurdles have to be overcome for San Diego to actually get to a net zero GHG emissions goal.
Yeah, and again, I would say for full disclosure, we supported the city of San Diego's climate action plan development, so we were kind of part of the team that did that. But I think I can talk about it in a broad but still meaningful way. The city of San Diego in 2015 adopted the last climate action plan, and at that time, it was a very aggressive plan, and it kind of set the standard in our region and I think beyond. But they were the first city in our region and one of the few, or one of the first, I think, nationwide, to go to 100% renewable target by 2035. And so I'm going back now, the 2015 CAP climate action plan was unique or was kind of aggressive in that way. And it really kind of set the bar in our region for, at least for renewable energy. So we saw after that was adopted, many other cities developing plans and adopting similar kinds of things. I would say that the city's 2022 update is kind of similar. And so you have the city, the first one in our region to adopt, as you mentioned, a 2045 or a net zero target. And so, I'm sorry, I'm getting a call here. Sorry about that. And so, yeah, the city of San Diego has in their latest cap, they've adopted kind of more aggressive targets. First one in our region, including a net zero target. They also have some fairly aggressive targets around in the transportation sector around reducing vehicle miles traveled and putting in place policies and practices to get people out of their single occupancy vehicles and into some other form of transportation. And so, and if you look at the plan shows that in their target horizon, they would have a relatively, I think it's 2 million metric tons. I know that may not mean anything out of context, but 2 million metric tons of remaining emissions. And so the city would need to figure out a way to kind of, as I mentioned before, kind of compensate for those or neutralize those by doing removals and storage. Big challenge, as I said earlier, but the city has kind of moved in that direction. And yeah, it's going to be, look, I would say the net zero challenge about actually getting to net zero from removals and storage of removing carbon from the atmosphere and storing it is a challenge that the state of California is not clear on how to get there.
Yeah.
And so I think the city of San Diego, by putting this line in the sand for net zero, is a big step forward. I don't think they have all the answers, but as I said, I don't think the state of California has all the answers either for this.
Sure.
So it's going to be a challenge.
We can't get to the whole plan, but there are two elements of it I want to talk about. One is, so there's sort of 6 strategies that the city identified to achieve this net zero goal by 2035. One has to do with decarbonization of built environment. I'm sure this is like terminology that you're familiar with. Can you sort of explain to people what this means and how this furthers the net zero goal?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that part of the framework for reducing emissions, the general framework, is decarbonizing the electric supply, which we've talked a lot about, and then electrifying transportation and the built environment or buildings. And so what that means is, the transportation side is pretty clear, right? That means electric vehicles or some other kind of, like hydrogen or some other kind of zero emissions technology. But electric vehicles are very clear and easy for people to kind of understand. On the building side, it's similar, right? It means removing the combustion of fossil fuels from buildings and replacing it with electric. So for a typical home, so you have a water heater, you have a space heater, and you have a cooktop basically, are your main natural gas or propane, depending where you live, sources in your home. And so that would mean a heat pump water heater or an electric water heater, but a heat pump water heater is where it seems the market is going. And then for heating and cooling, heat pump, air source heat pumps are another technology to do that as well. There's a lot of challenges to get there, but that's what it means to electrify the built environment.
And there's a lot of public resistance to that, right? That's sort of been here in Encinitas, even where I'm recording now, is sort of the backlash to, Encinitas was one of the first cities in Southern California to actually ban natural gas stoves. So I wanted to just ask you, what do you think sort of the reality versus, again, we were talking about with nuclear, sort of the reality of public resistance to something versus actual hard, climate goals. What is the actual reality of pushing this vision along when there's so much public resistance to these sorts of ideas?
Yeah, you're right. Interestingly, the natural gas or gas cooktops there's people love their open flame cooktops, and by the way, we, for full disclosure again, worked with the city of Encinitas on their climate action plan, but also in the development of that all electric policy for new construction. And yeah, what we heard there and what we hear kind of broadly is, it's like, from my cold dead hands, you will take my natural gas cooktop. And so yeah, definitely same kind of thing, right? We can tell you, I can show you the math, I can show you the emissions and what would need to happen. But the question is, at the end of the day, this all needs to result in actual changes on the ground. People buying different appliances, people doing, making other choices from what they otherwise would. And so, yeah, it's not easy. I think that there's a couple different ways that the state of California handles this. is one is appliance standards, one is building code standards for new construction. But ultimately, when you're talking about existing buildings, it's just a function of, you know, when an appliance dies, what do you replace it with, and how can you put in place a system to encourage people to make the choices that are helping us either as a city or as a state or as a country or as a world get to the targets we need to get to. And right now, those again, I would look back to the one I mentioned earlier when I first came to San Diego, when there were just a dozen or so rooftop solar systems.
Mm-hmm.
And again, people said the same thing, right? Like, oh my gosh, this is too expensive, not going to happen, never going to happen. By the way, one of my first projects was the Department of Energy had a program called Million Solar Roofs. And the San Diego region was a funded project. In fact, that was the project that hired me to come to San Diego to work to get to 1 million rooftop. And at the time, it was a joke, right? And we had some tiny little sliver. This was a nationwide goal, 1 million rooftop solar, or 1 million solar rooftops. Well, California has over 1 million rooftop solars at this point, or solar rooftop systems. And so, again, I'm not saying that everything's going to go the same way that went. I'm just saying that, I mean, this is one of the benefits of getting old.
Yeah.
Right. It's one of the benefits of getting old is that you can look back 1 or 2 or 3 decades and see kind of where we've come. And so I think that we're in a similar state, right? Heat pump water heaters, in other parts of the world, they're used quite extensively, but in the US and particularly in California, not so much. And so, we're going to have rebates, we're going to have incentives, we're going to have tax credits, and all of these things are going to pull these technologies into the market, and then the market changes. I mean, that's exactly what happened to solar. You had all of these great incentives, pulled the technology in, prices went down. There's a lot of factors involved, but some of those policy tools pulled solar into the market, and then the market kind of kept it going. It's a whole question about whether there are still incentives or still rebates or incentives or subsidies for solar. But again, this is a similar situation where you kind of pull the technologies into the market with incentives, and then when you go to the store in the future, there just isn't going to be another option. It's like electric vehicles. 10 years ago there was one, or whatever. Now there's many, many more, and in 10 years, 20 years, there's just not going to be very many other options. The market will literally change to accommodate. I like to think of these kinds of changes as a bit of a dance between regulation on the government side and then market reform or market kind of reaction on the market side. And you kind of need both of those things, because the government isn't going to we can't subsidize our way out of this. And so the government puts in place rules of the road, some money, some goals, kind of puts in some guardrails, if you will, and then the market takes over. And look at the solar market. It's been remarkable over the last 20 years what the solar industry has done and become, based on some of those incentives and some of those guardrails put in place, back in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Sure. If I can ask one more question, I just want to know, like, for this plan, there's a lot of different components to it, but it seems like you can't talk about the San Diego's Climate Action Plan without talking about transit and transit infrastructure and sort of the impact that that's going to have on meeting this 2035 goal. Can you sort of talk about being familiar with the plan yourself, sort of how San Diego plans on working towards reforming transit infrastructure to the point where it's going to make a substantial difference?
Yeah, so maybe again, I keep zooming out for you, but when you think about transportation, it's the largest sector, or it's the largest emitting sector among all the sectors by far. It's almost twice as much as the next biggest one, which is electric and natural gas combined. And so something like 40 to 50% of emissions, depending on which city, which region. But certainly in our region, it's like 40% of all emissions are from the transportation sector. And by the way, fun fact, San Diegans drive, as a region, we drive about 30 billion miles a year. And if you just think about that, it's kind of insane, because the sun is 93 million miles from Earth. So just think about the math there a little bit. So yeah, a lot of miles driven, and now and historically have been mostly fossil fuel vehicles, changing slowly, but in certainly a positive direction. So we drive a lot, right? That's the thing. But if you look at transportation emissions, you really have three levers to reduce those emissions. One is to drive less. The other one is to use a cleaner fuel. And the third one is to become more efficient in how you drive or how the transportation system is designed. And so if you look at those kind of all, kind of one at a time, to drive less, what do? You have transit, you have bike walk, you have other things like, scooters and other kinds of small technologies like that. E-bikes is another sort of up and coming technology that we're seeing more of. But transit is certainly a key part of it, and or could be a key part of it. And one of the challenges around transit is that no individual city can change the transit system. It's more of a regional system, right? And so you had the SANDAG, the San Diego Association of Governments, or SANDAG, has their regional plan, which includes a lot of ideas and goals around transit and alternative forms of or modes of transportation other than single occupancy vehicles. And so it's gonna, individual cities can do certain things they can do. One of the things that cities can do is to build out their cities in a way that encourages transit use. And there's this chicken and egg argument, right? Do you build the trolley stop first, or do you build the development to pull the trolley stop in? But we have areas that have been identified at the regional level and in cities where increasing density could lead to and kind of encourage more use of transit. So there are certain things cities can do to encourage the way they build out their infrastructure, they build out. So there are definitely things they can do. And then the other one, alternative fuel vehicles or alternative fuels, mostly electric vehicles now. And so cities can put in public charging stations. Cities can convert their own fleets, so that their own vehicles are electric. And then there's other ways that they can encourage residents to move in that direction as well. So, and then the third piece about efficiency is more about sort of how you drive, or driving a more efficient vehicle, or having roundabouts so that you don't have to stop and idle, and things like that, and making the overall system more efficient no matter what fuel you're using, right? So if you are using, if you're using an all-electric vehicle, and let's just say it's 100% renewable electricity, there are no greenhouse gas emissions, but you're still using energy. And so if you can make the system more efficient, your electric vehicle will need less energy. So that's the idea around that third efficiency piece. So, but yeah, I mean, without getting into the specifics of the city's plan, I think those are some of the broad points or challenges that any city would see in reducing emissions from the transportation sector.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, it's not just a city issue; it's regional, and then regional, it's state. Another time when we have more time, I'd love to hear more of your in-depth thoughts on the RTP, because I think it's a really interesting plan. I think there's a lot of different fascinating avenues that you can take to discuss that conceptually, how that sort of pushes us in the direction of public transit versus arguments from people who want us to move back towards autonomous vehicles, for instance. And so there's sort of two different schools of thought there, or maybe even more than two, but I'd love to get into it another time. But we're out of time, so thanks so much, Scott, for coming on. I really appreciate your time. Again, you have a lot of in-depth knowledge on this stuff, and I think this is a great way to kick off the series. But for viewers and listeners, I'd encourage you to check out Scott's work. Again, he's with the Energy Policy Initiative Center at the University of San Diego. And thanks for coming on and talking about some of the exciting research you guys are doing and leading the field, and also discussing some of the state and local issues. So really appreciate your time, Scott.
Great, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, thanks. This has been another recorded episode of Stay Classy San Diego with your host, Steve Wire. Thanks again to our sponsor, MaxLux Media at maxluxmedia.com. And thanks to all of our listeners for tuning to the show. See you next time. Stay classy, San Diego.